The record shows, and what it reveals changes everything. Maxine Waters walked into the Senate hearing that morning wearing a designer suit reported to cost nearly $3,000, a choice that quietly undermined the message of financial accountability she claimed to represent. The contrast was striking in a way that required no exaggeration, like a symbol contradicting itself in plain sight. She moved with the confidence of someone who had spent more than 3 decades in Congress and grown accustomed to being untouchable. Everything about her presence suggested routine, control, and the expectation of another smooth performance. She looked like someone who fully believed this day would end exactly the way so many others had. Her talking points were clearly prepared well in advance. The familiar targets were already lined up: banks, corporations, executives, and the vague promise of tighter regulation. The moral outrage sounded practiced, calibrated, and ready for television. She knew which phrases would resonate on cable news and which ones would be clipped for social media. For 33 years, this formula had served her well. Across the dais sat Senator John Kennedy, a man whose appearance often led people to underestimate him. He looked more like a small-town lawyer than a political assassin. His reading glasses rested unevenly on his face, and his legal pad was filled with dense handwritten notes. There was a mild, almost puzzled expression about him that had disarmed opponents before. Those who mistook it for confusion usually paid for it later. Waters glanced in his direction and smiled politely. It was the smile of someone who believed she held the advantage. To her, he likely seemed manageable, maybe even predictable. She had outmaneuvered sharper critics using rhetoric alone. There was no reason, she assumed, this would be any different. The hearing began calmly, almost deceptively so. Waters was recognized and launched into her opening remarks with practiced ease. She spoke about accountability as if it were her personal trademark. She warned of unchecked financial power and cast herself as a defender of ordinary Americans. The performance was polished and familiar. Supporters responded exactly as expected. There were nods, murmurs of approval, and restrained applause. To anyone watching casually, it looked like another successful appearance by a senior lawmaker. Waters appeared firmly in control of the room. For a moment, the script held. Kennedy did not interrupt her once. He listened patiently, nodding occasionally, jotting down notes. He showed no visible reaction, no skepticism, no challenge. He waited until she finished and the room settled. Only then did he lean toward the microphone. He began politely, his voice slow and measured. He complimented the speech, calling it thoughtful and moving. Then, without raising his tone, he pivoted. He mentioned accountability again, this time in a different context. He suggested he had been researching it himself. He explained that his interest was not theoretical. It was specific, personal, and based on public records. He referenced finances, a congressional district, a family consulting business. He mentioned a bank that had received $12 million in taxpayer funds. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. The room grew quieter as Kennedy reached beneath the desk. He lifted a thick folder and placed it on the surface in front of him. The sound was firm, deliberate, and impossible to ignore. It was not theatrical, just confident. The sound of preparation. Before opening it, Kennedy paused. He said he wanted to clarify what accountability meant. In his view, it meant responsibility, consequences, and answering for one's actions. He asked if that definition applied here as well. Waters did not immediately respond. Her expression changed slightly. The smile remained, but it no longer reached her eyes. She shifted in her seat, preparing to engage. Kennedy did not rush. He simply opened the folder. What followed did not feel like a debate. It felt like the beginning of a case being presented step by step. Kennedy handled the documents carefully, methodically. There was no anger in his voice, only certainty. He began by outlining Waters's position: chair of the House Financial Services Committee, oversight authority over banks and financial institutions, influence over legislation affecting the entire economy, a role that carried immense power. From there, he moved to One United Bank. He laid out the timeline slowly and clearly. The year was 2008, the height of the financial crisis. Banks were failing, and taxpayer-funded bailouts were being issued. Most small banks were not considered. One United was an exception. Kennedy explained why. Waters' husband owned at least $250,000 in stock. If the bank failed, that investment would disappear. Shortly after, Waters contacted the Treasury Secretary. She arranged meetings between Treasury officials and bank executives. Officials later described the meetings as unusual. They said it felt like special treatment. Soon after, One United received $12 million in TARP funds. The investment was saved. Kennedy continued without interruption. The House Ethics Committee later investigated the matter. They concluded Waters had violated House rules. She had intervened in a matter involving personal financial interest. The consequence was an admonishment. No fine followed, no loss of power, no removal from leadership, just a warning. Kennedy let that sink in. He contrasted that outcome with how others had been treated. He mentioned prison sentences for far smaller financial violations. He noted the disparity without raising his voice. The point spoke for itself. Waters remained silent. Kennedy closed the folder, at least for the moment. He made it clear this was only the beginning. There were more documents, more timelines, more questions. And as the room absorbed what had just been laid out, it became clear that the hearing had shifted. The script Waters arrived with no longer mattered. The performance was over. The record had taken center stage. Kennedy reopened the folder and adjusted the stack of papers with deliberate care. He did not rush, and he did not dramatize what he was about to say. The calmness in his movements made the room feel smaller, tighter. This was no longer a discussion about policy or ideology. It was about records, dates, and outcomes that could not be explained away. He returned to the One United Bank timeline, this time adding context rather than accusation. He reminded the room that TARP funds were designed as a last resort, not a personal safety net. The money came from taxpayers who were watching retirement accounts evaporate in real time. Foreclosures were accelerating, layoffs were mounting, and trust in institutions was collapsing. Every dollar mattered, and every decision carried weight. Kennedy explained that Treasury officials later testified under oath about that meeting. They described it as irregular and uncomfortable. They acknowledged that political pressure appeared to influence the process. They admitted the meeting would not have happened without congressional intervention. Those words were not opinions, but sworn statements. He then addressed the Ethics Committee, finding again, slowly and precisely. The committee did not accuse Waters of misunderstanding the rules. It concluded she violated them. The language was clear, even if the punishment was not. Kennedy emphasized that distinction without embellishment. Waters attempted to respond by framing the bailout as community service. She described One United as a minority-owned institution serving underserved communities. Kennedy did not dispute that characterization. Instead, he reframed the outcome. He noted that the community inherited taxpayer-backed debt, while her family retained equity. He pointed out that public service and private benefit had intersected in one direction only. The risk was socialized, but the reward remained personal. That distinction mattered, he said, because it defined the ethical line. Crossing it undermined trust, not just in politicians, but in the system itself. Waters looked increasingly unsettled. Kennedy then moved to a new section of the folder marked with bright yellow tabs. He paused briefly, as if deciding where to begin. This part, he explained, concerned campaign finance. Specifically, it concerned her daughter, Karen Waters. The room shifted again. He laid out the basic facts without commentary. Karen Waters ran a political consulting business specializing in slate mailers. Slate mailers were simple printed materials advising voters how to cast ballots. They were widely used and widely priced. Any competent print shop could produce them. Kennedy cited typical market rates. $5,000 to $10,000 per campaign cycle was standard, sometimes less, depending on volume and design. He then contrasted those figures with documented payments. Waters' campaigns routinely paid Karen between $75,000 and $150,000. He did not accuse her of illegality. He acknowledged that campaign finance law allowed family members to be paid. The issue, he said, was scale and pattern. Over multiple election cycles, the totals added up. By his calculation, Karen Waters had received over $1.2 million since 2004. Kennedy paused to let the number settle. He then explained what that number represented. It was not a one-time expense or an isolated contract. It was a recurring arrangement spanning 2 decades, and it consistently exceeded market rates by a factor of 10 or more. He described how this system functioned in practice. Campaign donors contributed funds, expecting them to support outreach and messaging. Instead, a significant portion flowed directly to the Congresswoman's daughter. The service provided did not materially differ from cheaper alternatives. The premium was not for quality, but for access. Kennedy produced Federal Election Commission reports to support the claim. Each payment was documented, disclosed, and legal on paper. But legality was not the only measure of accountability. The pattern suggested something else entirely. It suggested influence monetized through family ties. He then expanded the scope beyond Waters' own campaigns. Other politicians paid Karen Waters as well. Many of them sought or received Maxine Waters' endorsement. The correlation was difficult to ignore. Hire the daughter, receive the support. Kennedy emphasized that no explicit agreement was required. The system functioned implicitly. Everyone involved understood how it worked. Plausible deniability protected the structure. But the financial trail told the story. Waters attempted to defend her daughter's qualifications. She described Karen as an experienced consultant providing valuable services. Kennedy acknowledged the claim but returned to the numbers. Experience did not justify rates 15 times higher than industry norms. Only influence could explain that discrepancy. He explained that this kind of arrangement eroded public confidence. It blurred the line between campaign activity and personal enrichment. It turned political power into a family enterprise, and it did so while remaining technically within the rules. That, Kennedy argued, was the most troubling part. He summarized the issue plainly. If Karen Waters had charged market rates, she would have earned roughly $150,000 over 20 years. Instead, she earned over $1 million. The difference was not consulting expertise. It was proximity to power. Kennedy then transitioned to the next section without pause. This time, the focus was the district Maxine Waters had represented since 1991. He held up a map of California's 43rd Congressional District: South Los Angeles, Inglewood, Gardena, Hawthorne. Communities with deep history and persistent struggle. He cited data from the year Waters first took office. At the time, the poverty rate stood at approximately 23%. Median income lagged behind state averages, but showed potential. Crime was a concern, but not yet endemic. There was reason for cautious optimism. He then cited current statistics. The poverty rate had risen to 31%. Median household income remained roughly half the state average. Crime rates ranked among the highest in California. Homelessness had exploded. Kennedy stressed that these were not partisan numbers. They came from government sources, census data, state reports, and independent studies. They reflected long-term trends, not short-term fluctuations, and they all moved in the wrong direction. He contrasted those outcomes with Waters's personal circumstances. He displayed a photo of her Hancock Park residence, a 6-bedroom home valued at approximately $4.5 million, located in one of Los Angeles's wealthiest neighborhoods, far from the district she represented. Kennedy pointed to the map again. Hancock Park was not within her district. It was not even adjacent. It was a world apart, gated, secure, and insulated from the conditions she spoke about publicly. He asked when she moved out of the district. The question was not rhetorical. It went to the heart of representation. Living among constituents provided perspective. Distance dulled accountability. Kennedy offered a contrast from his own experience. He noted that he still lived in Louisiana among the people he represented. He shopped at the same stores and attended the same churches. He saw the consequences of policy firsthand. That, he argued, was what representation meant. Waters attempted to reframe the issue as symbolic. She spoke of representing values rather than geography. Kennedy returned to outcomes. After 33 years, the district was worse off by every measurable metric. Meanwhile, her personal wealth had multiplied. He cited financial disclosures estimating her net worth between $2 and $6 million. Her congressional salary alone could not explain that accumulation. Other income sources filled the gap: speaking fees, book deals, consulting arrangements, the monetization of seniority. Kennedy did not accuse her of theft. He accused the system of allowing extraction. Public service had become a vehicle for private gain, and the people left behind paid the price. That, he said, was the core issue. As he finished this section, the room was silent again. Waters's posture had changed noticeably. The confidence she arrived with had faded. Her allies avoided eye contact, and Kennedy turned the page, preparing to continue. Kennedy did not linger on the statistics longer than necessary. He gathered the papers neatly and moved on, signaling that this was not the conclusion, but the foundation. The point had been established clearly enough. After 33 years, the district was worse off while its representative was significantly wealthier. That contrast framed everything that followed. He turned to another section of the folder, this one thicker than the last. These pages, he explained, documented public statements rather than financial transactions. Words, he reminded the room, carried weight when spoken from positions of power. They shaped behavior, expectations, and outcomes, and they left records that could not be denied. Kennedy began with a date from early 2017. Only months after President Trump took office, Maxine Waters publicly called for impeachment. There was no completed investigation at the time, no formal findings, just a declaration delivered with certainty. He continued flipping pages. April 2017, another call for impeachment. May 2017, the same demand repeated again. Television appearances, rallies, press conferences. The message never changed. Kennedy explained that his staff had reviewed the footage carefully. Between January 2017 and December 2020, Waters called for impeachment 28 times. That averaged nearly once every 7 weeks. It was a consistent pattern, not an isolated reaction. Impeachment became her defining political message. He asked a simple question. During those 4 years, what else had been accomplished for her district? What legislation had she passed specifically addressing local poverty? What hearings had she held focused on South Los Angeles? What federal resources had she secured for homelessness or crime reduction? Kennedy answered by citing her legislative record. No major bills passed targeting district-specific issues. No significant hearings held locally. Minimal funding secured with direct measurable impact. Meanwhile, media appearances multiplied. He contrasted priorities using polling data from her own district. In 2010, 68% of constituents identified homelessness as their top concern. Only 14% cited impeachment as a priority. The disconnect was stark. Waters focused on the issue that elevated her national profile, not the one hurting her community most. Kennedy did not accuse her of dishonesty. He accused her of misalignment. Her time and energy followed the cameras. Cable news rewarded confrontation and repetition. Her district received speeches instead of solutions. He described how homelessness surged during those same years. Los Angeles County saw a 63% increase. South Los Angeles was among the hardest-hit areas. Encampments expanded, services strained, and public frustration grew. Yet her legislative focus remained unchanged. Kennedy emphasized that impeachment rhetoric required little follow-through. It generated attention without demanding policy mastery. It created applause without accountability. It was politically safe inside her coalition, and it consumed years that could not be recovered. He then transitioned to rhetoric beyond impeachment. This section, he warned, dealt with consequences rather than popularity. He referenced statements made during periods of national unrest, statements delivered to crowds already on edge, statements that escalated rather than calmed. Kennedy played footage from April 2021. Waters stood before protesters during an active trial. Her words urged them to stay in the streets and become more confrontational. The trial judge later expressed concern those remarks could jeopardize proceedings. A mistrial was considered. Kennedy paused the footage. He read directly from the judge's statement. The comments, he said, risked influencing the jury and inflaming tensions. This was not a partisan opinion. It was a judicial warning. He cited reports from that same night. Protests intensified. Property damage increased. Injuries were reported. The situation deteriorated rapidly. Kennedy emphasized that leadership required restraint in volatile moments. Words spoken casually could ignite consequences far beyond intent. He noted that Waters did not remain to manage the aftermath. She returned to California. The community absorbed the fallout. He then referenced an earlier incident from 2018. Waters encouraged supporters to confront members of the Trump administration in public spaces. Restaurants, stores, gas stations. She urged them to create crowds and apply pressure. The message was explicit. Kennedy connected the dots carefully. Following those remarks, multiple officials were harassed publicly. Some were chased from restaurants. Others faced protesters outside their homes. The behavior mirrored her instruction. He addressed the double standard directly. When President Trump used inflammatory language, Waters labeled it incitement. She argued leaders were responsible for the actions of supporters. She voted to impeach him on that basis. Yet she applied a different rule to herself. Kennedy framed the inconsistency plainly. Either rhetoric has consequences or it does not. Either leaders are accountable for incitement, or they are not. The standard could not change based on political alignment. Selective accountability was not accountability at all. He referenced the January 6th investigation. Trump's words were dissected line by line. Intent, tone, and timing were analyzed extensively. Waters' rhetoric received no such scrutiny. The difference, Kennedy suggested, was not substance, but affiliation. He clarified that the issue was not free speech. It was responsibility. Leaders knew their platforms amplified impact. They knew supporters acted on cues. Denying that reality did not erase it. As Kennedy closed this section, his tone hardened slightly. The calm politeness remained, but the patience thinned. Patterns had emerged across finance, family, district outcomes, and rhetoric. Each reinforced the same conclusion. Power had been exercised without corresponding accountability. He stacked the papers again, preparing to move forward. Waters sat rigidly, no longer attempting to interrupt. The room felt heavy with accumulation. This was no longer about a single issue or incident. It was about a career under examination. Kennedy shifted his attention once more, this time to a section of the folder filled with charts and spreadsheets. These documents, he explained, dealt with appropriations rather than rhetoric. They reflected how taxpayer money was directed and redistributed. This was the quiet side of power, less visible than speeches, but far more consequential. It was also where patterns became hardest to defend. He reminded the room that the House Appropriations Committee controlled spending. It decided where federal dollars flowed and which projects received support. Membership on that committee came with influence few Americans fully understood. Earmarks could change the trajectory of organizations overnight. They could also create dependencies. Kennedy displayed a flowchart on the screen. It showed a simple sequence repeated multiple times. Federal funds were earmarked for organizations in Waters' district. Those organizations later hired Karen Waters as a consultant. Campaign donations followed shortly after. He walked through the first example carefully. In 2019, a community development organization received a $1 million earmark. 3 months later, it hired Karen Waters for $75,000. Within 6 months, its leadership maxed out donations to Waters' campaign. Each step was documented. Kennedy moved to another case. A housing nonprofit received $500,000 in federal funds. 2 months later, Karen Waters' firm signed a consulting contract worth $90,000. Soon after, campaign donations appeared from affiliated individuals. The pattern repeated with minimal variation. He emphasized that none of this was illegal on its face. The issue was not a single transaction. It was repetition and predictability. Over time, coincidence ceased to be a credible explanation. Structure replaced randomness. Kennedy cited an analysis from a government watchdog group. They cross-referenced earmarks with Karen Waters' client list. 63% of organizations receiving earmarks later hired her. That figure spanned multiple years. The consistency was striking. He explained how money effectively circulated. Taxpayer funds moved to nonprofits. Nonprofits paid consulting fees. Consulting fees enriched a family member. Donations flowed back to the campaign. Kennedy was careful with his language. He did not accuse anyone of criminal activity. He described a system that rewarded loyalty and compliance. It blurred ethical lines while remaining technically permissible. That distinction mattered. Waters attempted to defend the organizations involved. She described them as legitimate and community-focused. Kennedy did not challenge their missions. He questioned their incentives. Would they have hired Karen without the earmarks? He asked whether the consulting contracts reflected value or obligation. Were the services worth the cost? or were they the price of continued support? That question lingered without answer. The documents spoke louder. Kennedy then closed that section and turned to the final stack. This portion, he said, concerned competency rather than conduct. It addressed knowledge, preparation, and responsibility. Leadership required more than tenure. It required understanding. He began with basic economic principles. He asked about the federal funds rate. Waters hesitated. He asked about quantitative easing beyond definitions. The explanation faltered. Kennedy pressed gently but firmly. He distinguished memorized phrases from functional comprehension. Oversight demanded depth. Regulation required mastery of fundamentals. The gaps were evident. He played clips from past hearings. In each, Waters questioned financial executives. Her questions revealed misunderstandings of core concepts. Executives attempted to clarify. The explanations went unabsorbed. Kennedy paused the footage. He stated plainly that regulating what one does not understand was dangerous. Financial policy affected millions of lives. Mistakes carried real consequences. Ignorance amplified risk. He emphasized that seniority alone did not equal qualification. Power accrued automatically with time. Expertise did not. The system rewarded longevity over learning. That imbalance was visible. Kennedy gathered the entire stack of documents. The pile was thick and heavy. It represented decades of records. Each section reinforced the same theme. Power without accountability persisted. He summarized calmly. 33 years in office, a district worse off by every metric, a family significantly enriched, ethics violations documented and unpunished. He concluded that this was not about ideology. It was about outcomes. Representation was measured by results, not rhetoric. Accountability required consequences. The record showed neither. Kennedy sat back and folded his hands. He stated that he had no further questions. The silence that followed was absolute. Waters did not respond. The evidence had already spoken. The room did not immediately move on after Kennedy finished speaking. There was a pause that lingered longer than protocol usually allowed. Staffers exchanged glances without saying a word. Even members who normally filled silence with procedural chatter remained still. The accumulation of evidence had created a gravity that could not be brushed aside. Waters sat motionless, her posture rigid and her expression tight. She had entered the hearing expecting to dominate the conversation. Instead, she now appeared boxed in by her own record. There were no easy pivots left, no familiar slogans to deploy. Every attempt to deflect would circle back to documents already entered into the record. Kennedy finally broke the silence, not with accusation, but with reflection. He said hearings like this were not supposed to be personal. They were meant to test systems and safeguard public trust. But when systems failed for decades, individuals had to be examined. That was not cruelty, he said. It was responsibility. He addressed the broader implications of what had been presented. If seniority alone insulated lawmakers from scrutiny, accountability became optional. If ethics violations carried no meaningful consequence, rules became suggestions. If districts declined while representatives prospered, representation lost its meaning. Those patterns extended far beyond one person. Kennedy explained that nothing he presented relied on rumor or speculation. Every claim was drawn from public records, federal filings, ethics committee reports, legislative histories. These were documents accessible to journalists, watchdogs, and voters. The only difference was that no one had assembled them this way before. He emphasized that transparency was not an attack. It was a prerequisite for trust. When sunlight reached long-shielded practices, discomfort was inevitable. But discomfort was not injustice. It was often the beginning of reform. As the hearing adjourned, the reaction was immediate. Staff members were already circulating clips to media outlets. Phones buzzed across the room with notifications. Short excerpts began appearing online within minutes. The tone was unmistakable. By the time Waters exited the building, the narrative had shifted. Commentary no longer centered on banking regulation. It centered on accountability, conflict of interest, and tenure without results. Hashtags began trending before the evening news cycle began. The hearing was no longer confined to the chamber. Within hours, full segments of the exchange circulated widely. Not heavily edited clips, but extended footage. Viewers watched the sequence unfold in real time. The methodical pace made it harder to dismiss. There was no single explosive moment to isolate or spin. Media outlets struggled to frame the story. Some attempted to cast it as partisan theater. Others focused on tone rather than substance. But legal analysts acknowledged the documentation was solid. The facts themselves resisted easy dismissal. Commentators noted that Kennedy had not raised his voice. He had not insulted or speculated. He had simply presented records and timelines. That restraint amplified the impact. The contrast with Waters' usual rhetorical dominance was stark. Attention quickly turned to her district. Constituents began responding publicly. Some expressed anger, others disappointment. Many said they had suspected these patterns but never seen them laid out. The reaction was not uniformly partisan. Community leaders who had supported Waters for years spoke cautiously at first. They defended her legacy while acknowledging uncomfortable questions. As the footage spread, that tone shifted. Defensiveness gave way to silence. Silence gave way to reconsideration. Within 48 hours, protests formed outside her district office. They were not massive, but they were visible. Signs referenced tenure, wealth, and accountability. The messaging mirrored Kennedy's presentation almost verbatim. The record had migrated from Washington to South Los Angeles. Meanwhile, organizations previously connected to the consulting arrangements grew quiet. Statements were issued announcing changes in direction. Consulting contracts were not renewed. Donations paused. The informal system exposed during the hearing lost momentum overnight. Political allies distanced themselves carefully. Few offered public defense. Fewer still addressed the specifics. The safest political allies distanced themselves carefully. Few offered a full defense. Fewer still addressed the specifics Kennedy had laid out. Statements, when issued at all, focused on process rather than substance. Silence became the most common response. Behind the scenes, the impact was immediate. Organizations that had once relied on Waters' influence reassessed their positions. Some quietly announced new compliance reviews. Others signaled changes in leadership or consulting arrangements. The informal networks exposed during the hearing began to unravel. Attention then shifted to the House Ethics Committee. Complaints that had lingered for years were suddenly revisited. Public pressure made inaction politically costly. The committee announced a renewed review of prior findings. It framed the move as routine, but the timing spoke for itself. At the same time, a primary challenger emerged in South Los Angeles. She was young, relatively unknown, and had never held office. Her message was simple and disciplined. Representation required presence, results, and accountability. The contrast with a 33-year incumbent was deliberate. Early polling shocked longtime observers. Waters' approval numbers dipped below 50%. For the first time in decades, She was underwater in her own district. A majority of respondents said it was time for new leadership. The shift was swift and unmistakable. National media took notice. Coverage broadened beyond the hearing itself. Profiles revisited Waters' long tenure with a new lens. Achievements were weighed against outcomes. The balance no longer favored incumbency. Speaking invitations declined. Paid appearances were quietly canceled or postponed. Networks reduced her airtime. Producers avoided segments that would invite uncomfortable follow-up questions. The platform she once commanded began to shrink. Financial disclosures drew renewed scrutiny. Analysts revisited income streams previously considered routine. Context changed perception. What once looked normal now appeared excessive. The narrative had shifted from longevity to liability. The consulting business tied to her daughter felt the pressure almost immediately. Clients announced they were moving in a different direction. New contracts failed to materialize. The premium once justified by proximity to power evaporated. The market corrected itself quickly. Within months, a for-sale sign appeared outside the Hancock Park residence. Speculation followed, though no official explanation was offered. Some saw it as a financial decision. Others viewed it as symbolic. Either way, the image resonated. As the primary campaign accelerated, debates focused on local issues. Housing, crime, and economic opportunity dominated. Waters struggled to pivot back to district-centered messaging. Her record now followed every appearance. The hearing could not be escaped. On election night, the result was decisive. Waters lost the primary by 19 points. The margin stunned seasoned strategists. Name recognition and funding advantages evaporated. Voters chose proximity over prestige. Her concession speech was brief and defiant. She cited external forces and political hostility. She did not address the substance of the record presented. There was no acknowledgement of failure, no reflection on outcomes. Kennedy was asked days later whether he felt responsible. He responded without triumph. He said he had asked questions and presented public records. Voters made their own decisions. Accountability, he suggested, was not personal. Political science departments quickly added the hearing to coursework. Students studied its structure and pacing. They examined how documentation replaced theatrics. The lesson was clear. Evidence outlasted rhetoric. For many voters, the takeaway was simpler. A career built on seniority collapsed under scrutiny. Power without results could not survive transparency. The hearing became a reference point, a reminder that records matter. As attention moved on, the implications remained. Other lawmakers quietly reviewed their own histories. Ethics teams reassessed vulnerabilities. Longevity no longer guaranteed safety. The light had been turned on. In the end, the hearing was not remembered for a single remark. It was remembered for accumulation. Years compressed into hours. Patterns revealed through patience. A career defined by its own documentation. Political allies began distancing themselves with visible caution. Few rushed to defend her publicly. Even fewer attempted to challenge the substance of what had been presented. Most statements avoided specifics and leaned heavily on vague language about process. Silence quickly became the safest position. Behind closed doors, the damage was spreading faster than it appeared on television. Organizations that had once relied on her influence quietly reassessed their relationships. Some announced internal reviews without explanation. Others ended consulting arrangements without comment. The informal ecosystem surrounding her authority started to fracture. Attention soon turned to the House Ethics Committee. Old complaints that had sat dormant for years were suddenly reopened. public scrutiny made continued inaction untenable. The committee announced a renewed examination of prior findings. The timing was impossible to ignore. At the same moment, a primary challenger emerged in South Los Angeles. She was young, unknown, and lacked institutional backing. Her message was narrowly focused and relentlessly disciplined. Representation meant living in the district and delivering results. Longevity, she argued, was not an accomplishment. Early polling stunned longtime observers. Waters' approval rating fell below 50% for the first time in decades. A majority of respondents said they wanted new leadership. The shift crossed demographic and ideological lines. Incumbency no longer protected her. National media expanded its coverage. The story moved beyond the hearing itself. Profiles revisited her 33-year career with new context. Success was measured against outcomes rather than rhetoric. The balance no longer favored her. Paid speaking invitations began to disappear. Appearances were quietly canceled or indefinitely postponed. Television producers reduced her airtime. Segments that once guaranteed ratings now carried risk. Her platform shrank noticeably. Financial disclosures were re-examined with renewed skepticism. Income streams, once considered routine, took on new significance. Context changed interpretation. Patterns that had gone unquestioned now drew attention. The narrative hardened. The consulting business connected to her daughter felt the pressure almost immediately. Clients announced they were pursuing different options. New contracts failed to materialize. The premium once justified by political proximity vanished. The market corrected itself rapidly. Within months, a for sale sign appeared outside the Hancock Park residence. No explanation was offered. Speculation filled the void. Some saw financial necessity. Others saw symbolism. As the primary campaign intensified, debates returned to local issues. Housing, crime, and economic stagnation dominated discussion. Waters struggled to redirect attention. Her record followed her into every appearance. The hearing remained unavoidable. Election night delivered a decisive outcome. Waters lost the primary by 19 points. The margin stunned veteran strategists. Money and name recognition failed to compensate. Voters chose change. Her concession speech was brief and defensive. She blamed outside forces and political hostility. She did not address the substance of the record. There was no acknowledgement of failure, no acceptance of responsibility. Kennedy was asked whether he felt responsible for ending her career. He answered calmly and without celebration. He said he had presented public records. Voters made their own decisions. Accountability, he said, was not personal. Political science departments quickly added the hearing to coursework. Students analyzed its structure and pacing. They studied how documentation replaced theatrics. Evidence outlasted outrage. Records spoke louder than rhetoric. For many Americans, the takeaway was simpler. A career built on seniority collapsed under scrutiny. Power without results could not survive transparency. The hearing became a reference point, a reminder that accountability still mattered. The final phase of the fallout unfolded more quietly, but no less decisively. With the primary loss settled, attention shifted from campaign drama to legacy. What remained was not a single hearing, but a 33-year record now fully exposed. There were no new revelations, only consequences catching up to documentation. The process was slow, methodical, and irreversible. Inside Washington, the reaction was cautious and instructive. Career lawmakers took notice without saying so publicly. Staffers revisited old files and disclosures. Ethics Council began asking harder questions. Longevity no longer felt like protection. The hearing changed how power was perceived. It demonstrated that seniority could be audited. It showed that influence left trails. It reminded everyone that public records do not expire. All they require is attention. Kennedy's approach became a case study. No insults, no speculation, no dramatic accusations, only timelines, documents, and patience. What made the confrontation effective was not aggression, it was accumulation. Each piece alone was defensible. Together, they formed a pattern that could not be dismissed. Context turned legality into accountability. In South Los Angeles, the conversation continued after the election. Community meetings focused less on personalities and more on expectations. Residents debated what representation should look like going forward. There was frustration, but also resolve. Change had finally occurred. The challenger who replaced Waters faced immediate pressure. Voters demanded results, not symbolism. Promises were measured against action. The hearing had raised the standard. There was no room for complacency. Media retrospectives followed months later. They framed the hearing as a turning point, not because it was theatrical, but because it was thorough. It forced a reassessment of how long power could operate unchecked. It redefined what scrutiny looked like. Waters herself largely disappeared from public view. There were no long interviews, no rebranding tour, no acknowledgement of the record that ended her tenure. Silence replaced rhetoric. The Ethics Committee eventually closed its review. It cited jurisdictional limits and prior findings. No new penalties were imposed. For many, the decision felt familiar. Accountability had come from voters, not institutions. That distinction mattered. It underscored where real power still lived. Not in committees or titles, but in public attention applied consistently. Transparency did what enforcement did not. The phrase most often repeated afterward was simple: records matter. They outlast speeches. They survive narratives. They wait. Kennedy was later asked what lesson others should take from the episode. He said leaders should expect scrutiny proportional to their power. If that scrutiny felt threatening, the problem was not the questions. It was the answers. Documentation did not create guilt. It revealed it. In classrooms, analysts pointed to the structure of the exchange. Evidence first. Emotion last. Silence allowed to work. No rush to judgment. Just exposure. For voters watching from home, the takeaway was more direct. A powerful figure was examined without theatrics. A long career was measured by outcomes. The gap between rhetoric and reality was made visible. Nothing else was required. The hearing did not end corruption. It did not reform Congress overnight. But it reminded people that accountability was still possible, that patience could defeat power, that records eventually speak. And long after the cameras moved on, long after the headlines faded, one fact remained unchanged. 33 years of conduct had been reduced to evidence, and evidence once seen cannot be unseen.